Good afternoon. Please don't be afraid of the sword and the keys and the chains. I'm the jailer here in Philippi, but I don't put people in jail. I only keep them in jail once somebody else puts them there. So you're all out of jail. You don't have to worry about me. But if you ever get put in jail, you better know that I'm going to keep you there because I know that my job depends on it. Not only that, my life depends on it. So you want to stay away from these things. I did have one time, believe it or not, where I almost lost a whole jail full of prisoners. Scared me to death. But it ended up being the most memorable night of my life. You have a few minutes for me to tell you this story? Well, it all started when this foreigner named Paul came to Philippi. He was a Jew. And he came, he said, not just by accident. He had for a long time been establishing new groups of people who accepted his message about a man named Jesus being the Messiah. And he had done it over in Asia Minor, what you call Turkey. And he planned on going on there, but when he was in Troas, over on the other side of the Aegean Sea, he had a vision. And in that vision, someone said to him, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." And he believed it was God speaking to him, and so he came across to Macedonia, and he came here to our city, Philippi, in Macedonia. Well, when he got here, he looked for a synagogue to see if there were any Jews, and we don't have a synagogue in our city. He did hear that there were a few Jews who met out by the river. That's been a custom for a long time with Jews who aren't around a meeting place like a synagogue. Way back in the Babylonian captivity, when they were without a place to meet, they would go by the river and meet. And so there was a little group of Jews, not many, out there by the river, and Paul went out on Sabbath morning and he found them, and he told them his message. And there was a woman there who was not actually a Jew, but who met with them. Her name was Lydia. They call these people God-fearers, people who are Gentiles but are attracted to the Jewish religion and haven't really become Jews but worship with them. Now this lady Lydia was from Thyatira, over on the other side of what you would call Turkey. They have a specialty there of purple linens. And she found that it was a lucrative business here. There was quite a demand. And so she was doing very well. In fact, she had a nice big villa. Well, when Paul went out there and shared his message, she was so taken by it that she insisted that Paul and his whole entourage come to her villa and stay there and make that their headquarters and also their place to worship on Sabbath. So Paul started meeting there with a little group on Sabbath in her villa. And then during the week, he would go out to the marketplace and tell anybody who was willing to listen his story about Jesus the Messiah. And there were quite a few people who listened. There was this one slave girl, however, who followed him around. Went on for several days. She was a slave who had, they said, a spirit of divination, some kind of an evil spirit, and it enabled her to predict the future. And her masters got rich off of her, using her to predict the future for people. People would come and pay them to have her tell them the future. Well, when she saw Paul and listened to his message, she started going around and following him, and she would shout out behind him, "These men are slaves of the Most High God who have come to show the way of salvation." Sounds like pretty good advertising, actually, doesn't it? You couldn't pay people for that. But you know, it got annoying after a while to have her there shouting behind him all the time. And finally, one day, Paul turned around and in the name of Jesus ordered the spirit of divination to come out of her. And immediately, she was a normal person, which was great for her. Not so great for her masters who were getting rich off of her. In fact, they were furious. Their cash cow was gone. And so they went to the city fathers, the magistrates, and they complained. They said that these men were going around spreading things that were against Roman custom and Roman culture and Roman values. In other words, these men were un-Roman. Now, let me tell you, here in Philippi, there's nothing worse than being un-Roman. You see, we are not like the other cities here in what you would call Greece, Macedonia in the north, Achaia in the south. Those are provinces. Rome rules Macedonia. It rules Achaia, all of Greece, in other words. And cities like Thessalonica in Macedonia and Athens and Corinth down in Achaia, they are Macedonian or Greek cities ruled by Rome. But that's not us. Here in Philippi, we are actually a Roman city. We're not ruled by the provincial rulers that Rome sets up. We are ruled by Rome itself. We are a Roman colony. When you're here, it's as if you are in Rome. Actually, it's an old city. It was set up by Philip of Macedon about 400 years ago, but it fizzled out. That's where it got its name, Philippi. And then it was reestablished by Mark Antony and Octavian, who became the Emperor Augustus, as a Roman colony, specifically as a place for soldiers who had ended their service out in the eastern provinces to settle. And now it's become quite a thriving community, but here we are Roman. So to say that these guys are anti-Roman, well, they didn't take it all to that. The city fathers took them themselves outside my jail, and they beat them, left them bruised and bloodied, and then they came to me and said, "Take these guys, they are dangerous, make sure they don't get away." Well, I heard them. I put them way back in the back cell, furthest from the gate as possible. I put their legs in stocks and chains. There was no way they were going to get away. But you know, there was something about them when I led them back there. I had every expectation of getting what I usually got when I was putting a couple foreign prisoners in stocks. I'll tell you, I've been cursed in every language of the world. And every bad name you could ever think of, I've been called it. And I figured I was in for more of that. But these guys were different. They were kind. They didn't yell. I put them in stocks, and instead of wailing at their wounds, because their wounds really were bad, they started singing. And then they were praying to this God they believe in. I have to admit, it was strange, but it was strange in an admirable kind of way. I watched them. I actually felt sorry for them, especially with those wounds. Some of them were pretty deep. But I was running a jail here, not a hospital. So I let them be. Finally, it was time to go to bed, and I went to my quarters right next door and went to sleep. And then, about midnight, I was bolted out of bed by the fiercest earthquake I have ever felt. And of course, I wondered what happened, and I immediately ran to the prison, and there was the gate wide open. And I knew all the prisoners were gone, and I drew my sword and decided I would much rather die at my own hand than face what I knew I would face from letting the prisoners escape. But just as I was about to fall on this sword, I heard this shout from Paul. Don't! Stop! Don't hurt yourself. We're all here. And I looked around, and sure enough, they were all there. Paul and Silas and the rest of the prisoners as well. And you know, I went back and I let Paul and Silas out of those stocks, and I knelt down before them and said, please tell me, what must I do to be saved? I saw something in them that I knew I wanted. Well, they told me, believe in the Lord Jesus. Put your trust in him and you will be saved. But I wanted to hear more. I took them over into my quarters, and now I bathed their wounds. I do more of that now in the jail. And I fed them, and then I listened. Did I ever listen? I listened, and I decided this was just so exciting. I had to have my whole family here, so I got them out of bed. They weren't sleeping very well anyway after that earthquake. And we all listened to the story of Jesus and what he had done for us, how he had come to this world and died for us, and how he was now risen and was going to return. It was exciting. We listened to the story all night long, and in the morning, I decided and my whole family decided that we wanted to be baptized. And so Paul baptized us right there. But then I had to put him back in because, you know, the police were going to come in the morning and check things out, and I had to have the prisoners where they were supposed to be. Well, sure enough, the police came, and they had come from the magistrates, the city fathers, who had themselves come and put Paul and Silas in here with a great deal of fanfare. And they had a message. They told the police to tell me to go let Paul and Silas know they were free to go. They figured out they had a tiger by the tail with this earthquake and all of that, so they just said, listen, you're free to go in peace. And I expected Paul to hightail it out of there. That's what I would have done. Once that news came, I would have gotten out of there just as fast as I could. But Paul didn't do that. He amazed me. You know what he said? He said, they put us in here with a whole lot of fanfare. I'm not going to leave quietly. I want them to come and take me out the same way they put me in. When I have a nice escort from the city fathers, then I'll leave. And then the real topper. And he said, besides, let them know that we are Roman citizens. Wow. Talk about being un-Roman. There's nothing more un-Roman than beating Roman citizens. The police went back and gave that word to the magistrates, and when they heard it, they were scared to death. They came there to the jail, and I wish you could have heard them falling all over themselves to apologize to Paul and to ask him to leave. And so they escorted him out with some fanfare like he wanted. I don't think Paul did that just because he was arrogant. I think that Paul knew that putting him in there the way they did reflected on his message, and he didn't want people to see his message as something that was shameful, and so by taking him out, it showed that this had been unjust. But Paul didn't cause them problems. He left quietly. He went to Lydia's and said goodbye to everybody first. And then he went on to the next town. Pretty soon he was in Thessalonica. But we did not forget Paul. We have never forgotten Paul. Here in Philippi, we consider him not just the founder of our congregation, but we consider him our friend. He's come back a couple of times, and whenever we see him, there's just a warm glow of fellowship between this church and him. It's been over a decade, and we still meet in Lydia's villa. It's more crowded now than it used to be. But the church is doing well. We have been saddened, however, because we've heard that Paul is in jail again. And this time it's a much longer imprisonment. And so we've been praying for another midnight earthquake to get him out of there. But it hasn't happened. And we know as a congregation that Romans do not take care of their prisoners very well. If you don't have anybody to help you with some provisions, you may very well starve to death. So we decided that we would send Paul some things. We actually sent him gifts when he first left us. He usually didn't accept things from congregations. He worked on his own, worked with his own hands so he could give the gospel free. But he appreciated our gifts. In fact, let me tell you a secret. You won't tell anybody this, okay? This is just a secret. Of all the churches Paul started all through Turkey and Macedonia and Achaia, we're his favorite. Oh, I know you're going to say all kids think they're the favorite. I know how that is. I've got kids. But we really are. He's given us these little hints to let us know that we're his favorite congregation. There's just a warmth between us. And so we just couldn't bear the thought of Paul being there, maybe starving to death in jail. So we got one of our best, Epaphroditus, one of our elders, to carry some gifts to Paul to take care of him while he's in prison. But then we were saddened again because on his way to Paul, Epaphroditus got sick. In fact, he almost died. We were afraid our gifts wouldn't get there. But we understand after a while, he was healed, and he has gotten to Paul and given the gifts. And, of course, I'm sure given a report on what's going on here in Philippi. I hope he's told him about all the good things that are happening in this congregation, how we're growing, how there are more and more people studying, how there's just a depth of spiritual insight here. Although we are human beings, you know, so there are some problems in the church. I really hope Epaphroditus doesn't tell Paul about those. Paul doesn't need to be worried with our little problems. Basically, things are going well. There are a few people, though, who are being tempted by some traveling missionaries to think that Christians need to be circumcised to be Christians. And there's a little bit of disunity in our church. And then there are these two women, Euodia and Syntyche. I really, really hope Epaphroditus doesn't tell Paul about Euodia and Syntyche. Being in prison is bad enough, and I'm sure he doesn't want to hear the bad news about them. Because these are two women who were very close to him. They were co-ministers with him in his work. That was one thing about Paul. He used everybody he could find to minister, both men and women. And these two, Euodia and Syntyche, were co-ministers with him. But something's happened. We don't even know what set it off. But they are not speaking to each other. There's this tension, and it's kind of awkward. We meet, and we know we kind of have to keep Euodia over there and Syntyche over there because, well, it's just not good when they get together. I really hope Epaphroditus doesn't tell Paul about them. As I say, he doesn't need that on top of everything else. But now we've gotten some great news, some exciting news. Epaphroditus is coming back. And he is bringing with him a letter from Paul just to us, to the church at Philippi. I can't wait to hear what he says. I have all kinds of questions. How is Paul doing? Is he discouraged? Does he have any idea what's going to happen as a result of this imprisonment? Is he going to be set free? Is he going to be executed? Is he just going to go on and on? How is he feeling about it? Does he have any advice for us? Can't wait to hear that letter. And this week, Epaphroditus is going to get here. And that means that next Sabbath morning, we are going to gather in Lydia's house, and we're going to hear the letter that Paul has written just for this congregation here at Philippi. You really ought to come and be here. It's going to be crowded. You'll need to get here early. But you wouldn't want to miss it. A letter from Paul. We're going to hear it for the first time. If you don't know where Lydia lives, just ask anybody. They'll tell you where her villa is. Hope you can come and join us next week as we listen and hear what Paul has to say after all this time and after receiving gifts from us and get some of those questions answered. Well, I better get back to the jail now, but I do hope I'll see you next week when we hear what Paul has to say to us. Have a good afternoon.